every story has its turning point. For the man and his faithful dog, that moment comes quietly, almost tenderly, like a shadow falling across the station floor. The dog grows older, his muzzle silvered with time, his steps slower with each passing day. Yet still he waits, still he follows, still his eyes carry the same fire they held when he was just a pup on the platform. But love, no matter how strong, cannot outpace time. The man knows it, the dog feels it. Then the station, which once rang with laughter and footsteps, now bears witness to the silence of their unspoken farewell. There is no grand announcement of the end, no sudden crash of fate. Instead, it comes in moments, a hand lingering too long in fur, a gaze held just a second longer than before, a quiet walk to the station that feels different, heavier. The heart knows before the mind accepts it. This is goodbye. And yet, in that farewell lies a strange kind of beauty, because when the man takes his final journey, the dog does not falter. He stays. He waits. He turns grief into devotion, absence into presence, loss into legend. The story shifts here from companionship to memory, and memory, as fragile as it seems, can sometimes outlive flesh and bone.
Where truth meets imagination. Welcome to Facts and Fiction. The seasons turned again, as they always did, and summer gave way to autumn. The fields around Millfield glowed with gold and russet, leaves drifting lazily through the crisp air. Life carried on. Trains came and went. People hurried about their business. But for Ethan, the rhythm of his world was set not by clocks or calendars, but by Rufus. And Rufus was slowing down. It began subtly. Hesitations at the stairs, longer pauses when rising from the rug, a little stiffness after their walks. Ethan told himself it was nothing, just age catching up, nothing to worry about. But in the quiet hours when Rufus slept beside him, Ethan found himself watching the slow rise and fall of his chest with a gnawing fear he could no longer push away. One chilly evening, Ethan clipped the leash and opened the door. Rufus rose with effort, legs stiff, his muzzle gray in the fading light. Still, his eyes carried that same steady fire. They made their way down the familiar path, leaves crunching underfoot. The walk was slower than before, Ethan matching his steps to Rufus's careful pace. When they reached the station, Rufus sat on the bench with a long sigh. His gaze went to the tracks, but not with the intensity of before. He didn't strain forward, didn't rise when the train appeared. He simply sat, calm, as though he knew the truth. The waiting had changed. Ethan rested a hand on his back, feeling the warmth through the thinning fur. "We don't have to keep this up, you know. You've done enough. More than enough," he murmured. But Rufus leaned gently against him, eyes still fixed on the tracks, as if to say, "This is who I am. This is what I do." The train thundered past, sparks flashing in the dusk. Rufus didn't move. He lowered his head onto Ethan's lap, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't search the faces. And Ethan's throat tightened with the realization that the vigil was nearing an end. Word spread quickly in Millfield. The townsfolk had watched the man and dog for so long that Rufus's decline felt personal to them. Neighbors dropped by with soft blankets and fresh food. Children came quietly to the yard, kneeling beside Rufus to stroke his head. Even the station master, a gruff man who had once scoffed at sentiment, spoke softly when he passed them on the platform. "He's more loyal than any of us deserve," the old man said one night, pausing to adjust his cap. "If there's a heaven, it's already his." Ethan smiled faintly, blinking against the sting in his eyes. "I think he's already been living in it, as long as he's had someone to wait for." But Rufus was not done yet. Though his steps faltered and his breaths came slower, he still rose each evening when the whistle blew. Ethan considered carrying him some nights, but Rufus would never allow it. Pride still gleamed in his eyes. So they walked together, slower and slower, through the turning leaves, through the shortening days. It was in those long, quiet walks that Ethan found himself remembering more than he ever had before. His father's laugh, his steady hands guiding a boy through chores, the warmth of his presence on evenings by the fire. For so long, grief had buried those memories under anger and silence, but Rufus, in his steadfast waiting, had taught Ethan something he hadn't understood until now. Love wasn't about endings, it was about endurance. The waiting wasn't despair, it was remembrance. One evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of crimson over the fields, Ethan spoke aloud the words he had never dared before. "Thank you," he whispered, his hand resting on Rufus's head. Rufus looked up at him, eyes clouded but warm, and Ethan knew he understood. The townsfolk began to talk of honoring him, a plaque, perhaps, or a small statue near the bench where he had kept his vigil. Children drew pictures of Rufus and taped them to the walls of the station. Travelers who had only passed through once or twice remembered the sight of the loyal dog and asked after him when they returned. Rufus was no longer just a pet, or even just a companion. He was a legend woven into the story of Millfield itself. But legends are mortal, too. It was late autumn when the first frost silvered the ground, and Ethan awoke to find Rufus still curled on the rug, unwilling to rise. Panic surged through him, but when he touched his head, Rufus opened his eyes and wagged his tail weakly, as though to say, "Not yet, but soon." Ethan sat with him all that day, stroking his fur, coaxing him to drink water. As evening came, Rufus stirred, struggling to his feet. His eyes turned toward the door. Ethan's heart broke at the sight. "You want the station," he whispered. It was not a choice he could make for him. With tears stinging his eyes, Ethan lifted Rufus gently into his arms, cradling the weight that had once been so strong and unyielding. Step by step, he carried him down the road, the familiar path lit by the soft glow of lamplight. Townsfolk watched silently from windows, some with hands pressed to the glass, others with tears on their cheeks. At the station, he set him down on the bench. Rufus sighed, lowering himself with difficulty. The train whistle blew in the distance, faint and lonely. The dog didn't rise this time, didn't strain forward. He simply laid his head in Ethan's lap, eyes half closed, breathing slow and deep. The train passed in a rush of light and sound, and Rufus didn't move. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for someone to return. He was simply resting in the presence of the one who had stayed. Ethan bent over him, whispering words through his tears. "You don't have to wait anymore. You've kept your promise. You've shown me what love really means. It's all right, boy. Rest now." Rufus's tail thumped once, a faint echo of the strength that had carried them both for so long. And in that moment, Ethan knew the farewell was near.
The night after the train passed, Ethan stayed awake beside Rufus. The house was quiet, the world outside stilled by frost, but inside every sound seemed louder. The slow tick of the clock, the faint creak of the floorboards, the uneven rhythm of Rufus's breathing. Ethan kept a hand on his side, feeling the rise and fall, as though afraid it might stop the moment he looked away. He spoke softly into the dark, words tumbling out like confessions. "You saved me, you know. I thought I was broken, that nothing could fix the hole he left. But you stayed. You showed me how to keep living." Rufus shifted slightly, pressing his muzzle into Ethan's palm. The warmth was fading from his body, but the trust remained. Ethan bent close, his forehead resting against the dog's head. "If love could keep you here forever, you'd never leave me. But I know you're tired. I know." The hours stretched on. The moon slid across the sky, and the first hint of dawn crept through the curtains. Rufus's breaths grew shallower, softer, like the ebbing of a tide. Ethan felt it with a crushing certainty. The moment he had dreaded for so long was here. And then, as the sun touched the horizon, Rufus lifted his head one last time. His eyes met Ethan's, clouded but clear enough for one final exchange, one last silent promise. "I was yours, always." With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his years, Rufus laid his head down and stilled. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the still form, his chest constricting until he thought he might shatter. His hand shook as he stroked the fur one last time, desperate to memorize the feel before it was gone forever. When the grief finally broke, it came like a storm. Ethan buried his face in Rufus's neck, sobs tearing through him, raw and unrestrained. He clung to him as if love alone might pull him back, but the truth was inescapable. His faithful companion, his guardian, his last connection to his father, was gone. Word spread quickly through Millfield. By midday, neighbors gathered quietly at Ethan's door, hats in hand, voices hushed. They brought food, blankets, and awkward words of comfort. But more than anything, they brought presents. They came not out of pity, but out of respect for Rufus, who had belonged to them all in some way. The station master arrived in the evening, his weathered face drawn but steady. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We'll honor him, lad, the whole town. He deserves nothing less." And so they did. A few days later, the town gathered at the station. It was a cold morning, breath rising in clouds, but no one seemed to mind. Farmers, shopkeepers, travelers, all came to pay tribute to the dog who had waited. Children clutched flowers, elders bowed their heads. Even strangers who had only passed through Millfield once or twice made the journey back, compelled by the memory of the loyal figure at the platform. Ethan stood with them, Rufus's collar in his hand, the leather worn soft from years of use. His chest ached, but he felt a strange steadiness too. The grief was sharp, yes, but beneath it was something else. Pride, gratitude, love that could not be erased by loss. The station master spoke first, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We all saw him, day after day, through snow, through rain, through years. He never faltered, never forgot. That kind of loyalty, well, it teaches us something, doesn't it? Reminds us what truly matters." Others shared their memories. A shopkeeper recalled how Rufus had once chased off a thief from her store. A farmer spoke of the times Rufus had joined him in the fields, tail wagging. Children described how safe they felt when Rufus walked them home after school. Each story was a thread weaving together the tapestry of his life.
When Ethan's turn came, he struggled to find words. He looked at the crowd, at the faces reflecting the same grief and reverence he felt. Finally, he lifted the collar slightly, his voice breaking, but clear. "He wasn't just my dog. He was my family. He carried me through things I couldn't face alone. And he taught me something I'll never forget, that love doesn't end. Not when someone's gone, not ever. It stays if you're brave enough to keep it." The silence that followed was heavy with respect. Then the townsfolk stepped forward, one by one, laying flowers around the bench where Rufus had kept his vigil. The pile grew until it was a sea of color against the gray of the platform. Children placed drawings, crayon depictions of Rufus with bright eyes and wagging tail. Travelers left tokens from distant places, a scarf, a coin, a book, symbols of the journeys he had silently witnessed. Ethan stood back, overwhelmed. Rufus had belonged to him, yes, but in another way, he had belonged to everyone. His loyalty had touched them all. And in that moment, Ethan realized his companion would never truly be gone, not as long as stories were told, as long as people remembered. That night, Ethan returned home alone. The house was unbearably quiet, every corner echoing with absence. He set the collar on the mantelpiece, resting beside a faded photograph of his father. For a long time he stood there, staring at the two objects side by side, the man who had raised him and the dog who had saved him. The grief still cut deep, but beneath it was a strange peace. Rufus had kept his vigil until the very end, and Ethan had learned how to carry love forward, even through loss. In the days that followed, he walked the path to the station alone. At first it was agonizing, every step a reminder of the absence at his side. But slowly, the pain gave way to something gentler. The path became a place of remembrance, each leaf, each stone echoing with memories. One evening, as he stood by the bench, the whistle of a train echoed in the distance. The sound no longer brought a surge of dread or grief. Instead, it stirred something softer, a sense of connection, of continuity. Rufus wasn't there to rise and watch, but Ethan felt him as real as the wind on his face. "You're still here. You always will be." And he believed it.
Winter deepened over Millfield, wrapping the town in frost and silence. Snow gathered on rooftops, blanketed the fields, and drifted across the tracks at the station. For many, it was an ordinary season, harsh but familiar. For Ethan, it was his first winter without Rufus. The absence was everywhere. In the empty rug by the fire, in the unclaimed bowl by the door, in the quiet walks that felt incomplete. At first, the grief was a weight he carried everywhere, pressing on his chest until it seemed he could scarcely breathe. But grief, like snow, slowly settled, reshaping itself into something softer. The pain didn't disappear, but it dulled into memory, into something he could hold without breaking. One evening, Ethan found himself walking the familiar road to the station, his breath rising in pale clouds. The platform was deserted, save for the bench that Rufus had spent so many years on. Snow lay thick on its wooden slats, untouched since the last storm. Ethan brushed it clear with his glove and sat down, the cold seeping through his coat. He closed his eyes and listened.
The wind whistled through the telegraph wires. The rails hummed faintly with distant vibrations. It was the same soundscape Rufus had known, the same waiting place. And though the bench was empty beside him, Ethan could almost feel the weight of the dog's head resting on his knee. When the train thundered past, he didn't cry. Instead, he whispered into the rush of sound, "I remember." The townsfolk remembered too. The flowers they had laid at Rufus's vigil were long gone, wilted and cleared away, but their spirit lingered. Conversations turned again and again to the faithful dog, as if speaking his name kept him alive in their hearts. Children asked their parents to retell the story, wide-eyed and solemn, as though hearing a legend. Travelers still asked about him when they passed through, and those who hadn't seen him were told the tale with reverence. It was the station master who first proposed something more permanent. One morning, as Ethan stood on the platform, the old man joined him, hands clasped behind his back. "The flowers were fine, lad, but they fade too quickly. A memory like his deserves more than that." "What do you have in mind?" Ethan asked, though a part of him feared the answer. "A memorial. Something the town can keep. Something travelers can see. A marker that says he was here, and that loyalty like his matters." The thought pierced Ethan's chest. The idea of a memorial was comforting, yet it carried the sharp edge of finality. It meant accepting Rufus's absence as permanent, enshrining him not as a presence, but as a memory. Still, when he looked at the bench, weathered, quiet, but imbued with years of waiting, he knew the station master was right. Rufus deserved it. More than that, the town deserved to keep the reminder of what he had stood for. The decision was made at a town meeting. Everyone agreed at once. Some suggested a plaque, others a statue, still others a small garden by the station. Ideas poured out, each offered with love. In the end, they settled on two things: a bronze statue of Rufus at the bench, and a plaque that told his story for travelers to read. Donations came quickly. Coins in jars at shops, envelopes slipped under Ethan's door, even contributions from strangers who had only heard the tale. Ethan himself struggled with what to give. Money felt too small, words too weak. In the end, he offered something else: Rufus's worn collar. It would be preserved in the town hall, displayed with photographs and letters, a piece of history tangible enough to touch. The weeks passed as plans took shape. Sculptors came to study old photographs and sketches of Rufus, noting every detail: the proud set of his shoulders, the gentle curve of his ears, the way his eyes seemed always fixed on the horizon. Ethan provided everything he had: faded photos, scribbled notes, even his own memories, spoken aloud until the artists swore they could see Rufus as clearly as he had. When the statue was unveiled in early spring, the whole town gathered once more. The snow had melted, crocus pushing bravely through the thawing soil. The bronze figure stood on the platform beside the bench, life-size, lifelike. Rufus sat with head high, eyes fixed forward, as though still waiting for the train that might bring his master home. Ethan's breath caught when he saw it. For a moment, it was as if Rufus had returned, eternal, unfiring, watching the tracks. The crowd was silent, reverent,
until the station master stepped forward to read the plaque aloud. Here sat Rufus, the faithful companion who waited at this station for years, a symbol of loyalty and love that outlasts time itself. He belonged to one man, but in his waiting, he came to belong to us all. May we learn from his patience, his devotion, and his heart that never gave up. A hush lingered, broken only by the sound of a train approaching in the distance. As it roared past, many in the crowd lifted their eyes to the bronze figure, and in that rush of sound and wind, it felt as though Rufus himself had been honored by the passing of every journey, every traveler, every story carried along the rails. For Ethan, the moment was wound and balm. He felt the ache of loss sharpen again, but it was steadied by pride. Rufus had not only been his companion, he had become a legend, his love remembered by all. That night, Ethan returned to the station alone. The platform was quiet, the statue glowing faintly under the lamplight. He sat on the bench beside it, the way he had done for so many years. "I miss you," he whispered, looking at the bronze likeness. "Every day. But I think you knew this would happen, didn't you? You weren't just waiting for him. You were teaching me how to wait, how to carry love even when it hurts." The statue didn't move, of course, but in the stillness, Ethan felt the presence of Rufus as strongly as ever, steady, faithful, eternal. For the first time since the farewell, Ethan smiled through his tears. The waiting was over, but the love would remain forever.
Spring blossomed in Millfield, and with it came a sense of renewal. The fields turned green again, flowers pushed through soft earth, and the air carried the sense of growth and promise. The station was busier than ever, its trains carrying travelers to and from distant places. But for many who stopped there, their eyes were drawn not to the schedule or the platform, but to the bronze figure that now kept its eternal vigil. Children clambered onto the bench to sit beside the statue, tracing the cold metal with small hands. Travelers snapped photographs, pausing to read the plaque, their expressions softening as they learned of the dog who had waited. Some wiped their eyes, others left tokens at his feet. Flowers, scraps of ribbon, even a folded note or two. Rufus had become part of Millfield, and his story continued to ripple outward with every passing train. For Ethan, life moved forward in quiet, halting steps. The grief was still with him, sharp in unexpected moments. The empty sound of the latch on the gate, the silence when he opened the door. But alongside it there was now something else, gratitude. Rufus had given him more than companionship. He had given him a way to live again, a way to remember without drowning in loss. Ethan's walks to the station continued. At first they were heavy with absence, but slowly they became lighter. He began to notice things he had overlooked before. The songs of birds in the hedges, the play of light across the fields, the laughter of children chasing each other down the lane. He began to greet his neighbors more warmly, to linger in conversations, to accept their invitations for supper or tea. The world felt different now, still tinged with sorrow, but no longer empty.
One evening, as he sat on the bench beside Rufus's statue, a small boy approached. His hair was tousled, his hands clutching a bunch of wildflowers. Without a word, he placed them at the statue's feet. Ethan smiled at him. "Did you know him?" Ethan asked gently. The boy shook his head. "My mum told me about him. She said he waited a long time. She said he was brave." "He was," Ethan replied, his throat tightening. "He was the bravest soul I've ever known." The boy nodded solemnly before scampering back to his mother, leaving Ethan with the flowers and the memory. It struck him then that Rufus's story wasn't just about loss. It was about hope, about the strength of love to echo beyond a single life, to reach people who had never even met him. As weeks passed, Ethan began to feel the stirrings of something he hadn't known in years: purpose. He found himself volunteering at the town's small shelter, helping care for abandoned dogs that needed food, warmth, and kindness. At first, it was painful. The sight of wagging tails and pleading eyes reminded him too much of Rufus. But slowly, the pain softened into something healing. Each animal was a chance to give back what Rufus had given him: loyalty, patience, love. There was one in particular who caught his attention: a timid little collie with mismatched eyes and a habit of curling into the corner of her kennel. She had been abandoned by travelers, left tied to a post until the shelter took her in. She flinched at sudden movements, avoided strangers, but when Ethan sat quietly near her, she crept forward, inch by inch, until her nose touched his hand. The first time she wagged her tail for him, Ethan felt something stir deep in his chest, a mix of ache and warmth. He visited her often, never rushing, never forcing, and slowly she began to trust. The townsfolk noticed, of course. "Looks like you've found yourself a friend," the shelter keeper remarked one afternoon, watching as the collie pressed her head into Ethan's hand. Ethan hesitated, torn between fear and longing. Could he open his heart again? Was it betrayal to love another dog after Rufus? The questions gnawed at him. That night, he sat by the statue, staring at the bronze figure under the lamplight. "I don't want to replace you," he whispered. "No one ever could. But maybe I can keep what you gave me alive. Maybe I can share it." The wind stirred softly through the station, carrying with it the faint sound of an approaching train. Ethan closed his eyes, and in the quiet between the whistle and the roar, he felt it again, that steady, silent presence. Rufus wasn't gone. He was in every act of love Ethan chose to give. A week later, Ethan returned to the shelter with a leash in hand. The collie looked up at him, ears twitching, and for the first time she didn't retreat. She wagged her tail, tentative but certain. Ethan knelt, fastening the leash gently. "Come on, girl," he murmured. "Let's go home." The first steps were uncertain. She balked at noises, hesitated at corners, but Ethan matched her pace, patient and steady. With every step, his heart grew lighter. She wasn't Rufus. She wasn't meant to be. She was herself, different, but no less deserving of love. Life settled into a new rhythm. The collie, whom Ethan named Hope, followed him on his walks, her steps quick and eager once she trusted the path. Together, they visited the station, where she sniffed curiously at the bronze statue before curling at Ethan's feet. Townsfolk smiled at the sight. their hearts warmed by the continuation of a story that had seemed to end. In time, Hope learned to wait, too, not with the same solemn vigil as Rufus, but with a light-hearted patience, her eyes always on Ethan. And Ethan found himself speaking more freely, not only to her, but to others. He began sharing Rufus's story with travelers, with children, with anyone who paused by the statue. Each telling was a way of keeping his memory alive, of passing forward the lesson that love, true love, never truly ends. Years passed, seasons turned. Ethan grew older, his hair grayer, his steps slower, but he was never alone again. Hope stayed by his side, gentle and loyal, her presence a balm to his heart. And always they returned to the station. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the whistle of a train echoed across the fields, Ethan sat on the bench between bronze Rufus and living Hope. His hands rested on cold metal and warm fur, past and present joined. He looked out at the tracks, the horizon stretching endlessly beyond, and felt a deep peace settle over him. Rufus had waited with love. Hope had walked with love. And Ethan, who had once felt only grief, now carried both with gratitude. The waiting was over, but the love endured, unchanged, unending, eternal.